Hello, students, and welcome to another episode of College Prep World History. I'm Mr. Willis, and this time we're bringing you a lesson on the Soviet Union beginning to move towards a more democratic style of system for their government. And this has a lot to do with the different changes in the leadership within the Soviet Union. And over time, we're going to see a loosening of that communist grip on the people of the Soviet Union. You see that with our cartoon here on the first slide. The next generation of Soviet leaders, all right, are going to be ones that look a lot more democratic than the previous ones. And in the cartoon here, you see two of the post-Joseph Stalin leaders who we will be covering here in our presentation today. And you can see the different styles that they're going to implement. Some are going to be similar like Stalin, some are going to be a little bit different than Stalin. And so we'll kind of cover them here in just a moment with you guys. All right, so on our first informational slide, we have, we kind of need to cover what happens after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1954. In 1954, a man by the name of Nikita Khrushchev becomes the Soviet leader. So we want to write down Nikita Khrushchev, which is our second bullet point on this slide. So Nikita Khrushchev basically wanted to separate the Soviet Union from that nasty global image that Stalin portrayed to the world. And so he will implement a system called de-Stalinization. So write down de-Stalinization. And the program of de-Stalinization is an attempt to totally erase or to totally separate the Soviet Union from the relationship that they've had from Joseph Stalin and to start basically anew. And so this would include, tearing down statues of Joseph Stalin, reversing a lot of the very abrasive and extreme policies that Joseph Stalin had implemented in the Soviet Union. That includes, when he jailed his opponents, which, totalitarian dictators will do. They'll jail or kill opponents. If he had jailed them, or they would be, freed from jail, right? And Nikita Khrushchev, for the most part, is going to implement a much more peaceful relationship with countries that are capitalists, democratic states. Even though Khrushchev is the premier of the Soviet Union during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Mr. Gordon presented on prior to this, Nikita Khrushchev, for the most part, is implementing a much more peaceful diplomatic relationship between the Soviet Union and the Western states that are democratic. So on our next slide, we're going to talk about Khrushchev's replacement. And again, I know we're kind of racing through this information because we just want to kind of see the different scenarios that are at play with the different leaders and how they rule differently. And Nikita Khrushchev loses power because of his failure at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I told my students that at the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the reasons why JFK is successful is the blockade by the U.S. Navy of Cuba, basically circling the Cuban islands, forced Nikita Khrushchev to make a very difficult decision, and that decision ultimately makes him look very weak in the eyes of other communist nations and his own people. And so therefore he's replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. And so you want to write down Leonid Brezhnev, who is pictured here in this propaganda piece, right? Why is it that we see all these totalitarian leaders pictured with children and with flowers and with babies? We saw this with Stalin. Now we're seeing this with Brezhnev. And so you can kind of probably assume what we're going to say about Leonid Brezhnev is that he's going to be much more like Stalin. So Leonid Brezhnev, he is somebody who wants to revert back to a more Stalinistic type of government. He wants to limit human rights and that we would see as important to our American way of life. He is very much anti-American, and so some of those limiting of human rights include, limiting freedom of speech and worship and protest, and telling the people of the Soviet Union that they have a place in society and that they need to follow the rules. All right, so you want to write down Leonid Brezhnev. You want to know that he's much more of a strict leader. Khrushchev was much more of a diplomatic leader, and Brezhnev is going to enact what he is the Brezhnev Doctrine, and you want to write that down as well. The Brezhnev Doctrine is his way of preventing the Soviets, or preventing communist nations like the satellite countries of Eastern Europe from rejecting communism by threatening. All right, and so fear is a very effective tactic for totalitarian regimes, And so Khrushchev, who was a political premier, is going to give way to Brezhnev, who is a much more strong leader because he's ruling. He's trying to use that strength to rule and to place fear on those satellite countries. Well, how does the U.S. react to all this? Well, you can see the picture here with President Richard Nixon, which you probably have seen in our videos. If you're watching When We Left Earth, Richard Nixon is president when the United States lands on the moon in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And prior to Richard Nixon's election as president of the United States, the U.S. had adopted this policy called brinkmanship, which I had lectured about before. And to again kind of sum up what brinkmanship is we're willing to go to the brink of war to combat communism. We do this on several different occasions, and we're going to see this form of combating communism start to become less and less popular, right? We're not going to see a Cuban Missile Crisis happen. We're going to see the gradual decline of violence in the Vietnam War during the 70s, right? And the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and President Johnson administrations were the ones that really pushed for brinkmanship. So Richard Nixon, and again, you want to write this piece down. Richard Nixon uses detente, and detente means lessened tension. We're no longer willing to go to the brink of nuclear war. We want to deal with, and this is much more of a President Kennedy idea as well. He uses this same type of policy, or a very similar type of policy. The idea that there should be a practical and flexible response on how you deal with the Soviet Union, all right, and it really should not include nuclear war. That's the big difference between Kennedy and Nixon. Right? We're not going to go to nuclear war. We shouldn't have to go to nuclear war because that ultimately could lead to the annihilation of humanity. So we don't want to end up in nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So as you guys can see in the picture, a diplomatic solution to the relationship between communism and democracy is a much more viable way to deal with that. Well, as we move into the 1980s, after the Carter administration, we have President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Again, we're going really fast here because I want you guys to see the different ways that we combat communism as a democratic or one of the leading democratic nations in the world. Here's a very far out there, no pun intended, way of dealing with communism. In 1953, President Reagan uses the Strategic Defense Initiative. He called it Star Wars. Yes, after the movie Star Wars. All right, and so you want to write down Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. All right, you probably can imagine what Star Wars was all about. All right, the idea here is that we not only use ground defense systems, but we can use outer space. All right, now that we're going into outer space in the early 80s, they're going to start using the space shuttle. We can put satellites into orbit around Earth, and we can use a space-based defense system. We can use lasers. All right, we can use missiles to intercept nuclear weapons if necessary. So it became much more about like a defensive nature under Reagan and trying to defend ourselves from the Soviet threat. But this policy never actually gets implemented And the big reason why is because the final leader, right? Sorry, I gave away the ending here. The final Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, is elevated to the leader, right? The secretary of the Politburo in 1985. And so the relationship between the Soviet Union and the U.S. will take a turn for the better. So make sure you write down Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, adopted by Reagan, right? Again, when you think Star Wars, think outer space. The idea that we can defend ourselves based upon space-based defense systems, and it never is actually implemented into reality. So we're going to now talk a little bit about Mikhail Gorbachev, who is now the new Secretary General leader of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. In 1985, he's elevated to Secretary General. And in our picture on this slide, you guys can see him on the bottom right-hand side with his hand up. Okay, he's on the very bottom first row there. Right, and he is the leading member of the Soviet Communist Party, and the most important members of the Soviet Communist Party are a part of this ruling committee, so to speak, and they call that the Politburo. So you want to write down our first bullet point here on this slide, which is the Politburo equals ruling committee of the Soviet Communist Party. And Mikhail Gorbachev is the leader of this Politburo. He's the Secretary General, which is the term used by the Soviets to be the most important member of the government. However, Mikhail Gorbachev, as I said before, is going to start implementing some changes within the Soviet government. And the big reason why he does that is because he wants to help the people. He sees that the people are not really being helped by this communist regime, and even though he's a communist or a member of the Communist Party, he has to implement some sort of democratic change to involve the people in the government, otherwise they're going to lose support from the people. And so his next two steps that we're going to cover are going to be some of the most important policies that are going to be implemented by the Soviet leader and are going to help loosen, or as I mentioned at the beginning, or at our title of our presentation, he's going to thaw the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States, and we're going to see the Soviet Union become much more democratic leaning because of these changes. So the first change that he's going to implement is called glasnost. Right? And glasnost means openness. So we want to write down glasnost, Glasnost, right? And this term means openness. And this is fairly democratic idea. Okay, think about the Soviet Union under Stalin and Brezhnev. You're not going to involve anybody's opinion on how you want to run the government. And this is the total opposite. Gorbachev is interested in improving society by asking the people how you can improve it. Think of that novel democratic idea. How can we improve our society? Let's ask the people. All right? And so this leads ultimately to opening of churches, publishing of books that were banned prior to this. If there's corruption within the government, it should be exposed. Right? These are very democratic ideals. And this term openness is the first step to trying to reform the Soviet Union's government, to try to make their economy better, right? And to improve society as a whole, and to get the people to actually take a vested interest in how they're being governed. This is a very democratic idea. So glasnost, openness, free flow of ideas on how to improve society. So we're going to show a quick video to you guys here on Gorbachev and his policies, and on the backside of this we'll talk about one of his other reforms, as well as how we're going to also move towards the opening up of Eastern Europe as well. So we'll catch you on the other side of this video.
The state of the Soviet Union and its society could be described very simply with a phrase used by people across the country. We can't go on living like this any longer. That applied to everything. The economy was stagnating, there were shortages, and the quality of goods was very poor.
Gorbachev took over a superpower sick with social breakdown, corruption in the Communist Party, and alcoholism. To tackle these ills and to revive a decrepit economy, Gorbachev called for reconstruction, or Perestroika, and a new spirit of honesty, glasnost.
I remember very clearly what Gorbachev said at that time. He said, there are two roads we can take. We can either tighten our belts very, very tightly and reduce consumption, which the people will no longer tolerate. Or we can try to diffuse international tension and overcome the disagreement between East and West, and so free up the gigantic sums that are spent on armaments in the Soviet Union.
Reykjavik, Iceland, the second Reagan-Gorbachev summit. Gorbachev now decided to re-examine Reagan's first ever arms control proposal, known as the zero option. Reagan had offered not to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe if the Soviets withdrew their SS-20 rockets. Brezhnev had turned Reagan down flat. Now Gorbachev wanted to cut a deal.
He understood that Perestroika and the internal changes were starting to slow down, that he had little time on his hands. He had to decide. Either he could free up resources from the arms race, or he'd be forced to look for them elsewhere. I was with him when he decided to confront Reagan with the question, did he or didn't he want an agreement? Did he or didn't he want disarmament?
Ronald Reagan did want disarmament, but would he give up his Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI?
I said, okay, let's not even leave 100 missiles. Let's abolish them completely and go for the zero option. This came as a shock. Everyone was surprised.
Reagan hit the table and said, well, why didn't you say so in the first place? That's exactly what I want to do. And if you want to do away with all weapons, I'll agree to do away with all weapons. All weapons, of course we'll do away with all weapons. Good. That's great. Now we have an agreement, yes. But you must confine SDI to the laboratory. No, I won't, said Reagan. No way. SDI continues. I told you that. I am never going to give up SDI.
I think that my principal position was and remains the same. The nuclear arms race should never be taken into space. It was difficult enough to limit the nuclear arms race on Earth.
Gorbachev pressed and pressed, and at one moment, President Reagan, who was very clear in his mind about this, wrote a little note and pushed it over at me. It said, George, am I right? I read this note. I said, absolutely, and passed it back.
The chance to make the most momentous agreement since the Cold War began, the elimination by the United States and the Soviet Union of all but 100 nuclear weapons each, was lost. Media, the fax machine, the computer, were opening up the USSR. Gorbachev and the Politburo watched satellite TV in their offices. After Olympic boycotts, the 1986 Goodwill Games were seen live both sides of the Iron Curtain. Gorbachev's policy of glasnost brought pop culture out into the open.
A new breed of young people was created by our intellectuals, a breed that rejected all our Soviet past. This was moral degradation. Our youth was being turned into human robots.
The Soviet people were being plunged into wrenching change.
We became particularly worried by the end of 1987. We saw that the country was not going in the direction it should. The situation of the people was getting worse and worse. The situation of the armed forces was no better.
Gorbachev reacted to growing opposition by pressing ahead with plans to reform the Communist Party.
И все-таки все то, что мы развернули через реформу, через демократию вот эту, через советы, через трудовые коллективы, через вот эти вещи все, включения, вот это только путь. К этому надо. Там уже вы, власть в натуре будете держать.
The main achievement of Gorbachev's policies was that in the space of a year or two, he made the fear disappear, as if by magic. People had lost their fear of speaking and acting freely.
If I hadn't promoted the reforms, if I hadn't tried to let the people breathe freely, if I hadn't tried to open the door to glasnost and democracy, to stir the society, to get it thinking and acting, I would probably still be in my Secretary General's armchair today. I could have stayed there a lot longer, since I'm still quite young.
Washington, D.C. Ronald Reagan still pursued his Star Wars vision. The Kremlin now believed that it would never happen, and therefore should not delay agreement on arms reduction. Gorbachev, in the United States for the first time, had come to sign an historic treaty. His visit, seen live on Soviet TV, enhanced his standing at home and abroad. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed a far-reaching agreement. For the first time, an entire category of nuclear weapons was to be abolished.
So that video shows us a good thing right at the end where Gorbachev and Reagan are, shaking hands and signing books to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that are being produced. And obviously that is a huge step forward in this thawing of the relationship between the two superpowers. You don't want to have nuclear weapons ready to fire at one another. It's just never a good idea. So the Soviet Union is going to continue to take steps to try to open itself up, like we saw with glasnost. And their next step is going to be a reform called Perestroika. And you want to write down Perestroika, right? Perestroika is a economic reform. That economic reform has to do with farms and factories and production, right? So rather than focusing maybe like Stalin did on, mass production, trying to westernize itself and losing out on some very important production for the people are now going to be given opportunities to maybe open up their own small businesses and to produce some sort of wealth. Very capitalistic of an idea for these people. And seeing as how they haven't been able to do this prior to Gorbachev, we saw this very briefly under Vladimir Lenin in the latter half of the 19-teens. But we now see that the people are beginning to get a little bit of taste of democracy, and they're going to want to take that and kind of run with it. So despite the fact that this is not going to fully eliminate communism from the equation, these are cracks in the figurative armor that we're seeing in the superpower communist regime of the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, very important steps if you're the Americans, because you're seeing them move towards the middle, move towards closer to democracy. And that is that was probably totally unheard of in the 1940s and 50s. You would have thought that was crazy. But in the 1980s and the early 1990s, this is totally now possible. And so another major political reform, we kind of talked about glasnost and opening up socially for the people. Perestroika economics. Now we have political reform. They're going to allow for the formation of a legislative body, all right? And that legislative body is going to be governing at the Kremlin, all right? And that's proposed by this legislation called democratization by Gorbachev. And again, this is the people trying to implement their say within the government, get rid of unpopular leaders, oust them, and start to implement changes in the political system that favor the people. So you're really beginning, just like democracy is ruled by the people, that term meaning ruled by the people, you're beginning to see systems, you're beginning to see ideologies being put into place in the Soviet Union that push for the involvement of the people within the governing system. And we're going to see that as we move into the 1990s. All right, so now we're going to show you guys a video on the fall of the Berlin Wall. I know we haven't really talked about that in great detail, but it plays a very integral role in the breaking down, or the beginning of the breaking down, of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. And if you recall, the Berlin Wall at the conclusion of World War II in the 1940s was split into sectors, right? And then eventually the Soviets had built a physical wall that separated East and West Germany. That wall will fall. It will break. It will be torn down. This is going to allow Germany to form into a unified country again. So here's our video on the fall of the Berlin Wall.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, reporting tonight from Berlin.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go. Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant. Something, as you can see, almost to party on. How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history? The East German government said tonight they were going to make more openings in the wall, at least a dozen more, put bulldozers right through the wall so that more people could cross to the west. The East German communist leadership tonight said there'd be a new election law guaranteeing secret elections which the rest of the world could monitor. And only 24 hours after East Germans were told they could go anywhere, anytime, the Soviet Union said that was a sensible move. Thousands of East Germans came across the border today, perhaps more than 100,000, so many that border police lost count. And at every border crossing, thousands of West Germans there to say welcome. Some of the really good news today was for the East German government. While thousands and thousands came to look, even gape at this showcase of capitalism, the vast majority said they would be going back. The simple act of giving people the freedom to travel may have convinced East Germans they need not take flight whenever the door opens just a fraction. It has been an astonishing day. Hour after hour, all through today, thousands and thousands of West Germans have come to the wall to see for themselves, to climb up on this hideous structure, to finally look down at what has been no man's land for so long. Finally, after all these years, to say in person what they think of the East German border guards, or try to make friends. Suddenly, a flashback to what it was like for so long. A young man in the East makes a dash for the wall. They catch him and take him away. Presumably, he should have used a legal border crossing. Only a couple of years ago, he might have been shot. Not today. Today, it was possible to have a dialogue. Your government seems to be changing every day. Where do you think it's going? That's the government's problem, he says.
not mine. Such an astonishing moment in history.
Now, what's it feel like to be standing on top of the wall?
It's incredible for me. It's I can't describe really my feelings. It's something unreal for me.
If there is someone who sleeps for 8 weeks and you told him what happened here, he thinks you're crazy. It's unthinkable.
Unthinkable. Tonight at the border crossings, including Checkpoint Charlie, which is normally a crossing for non-Germans only, there was still a block-long gauntlet of goodwill. Here, as everywhere else, it is one breathtaking moment after another. The new arrivals in their tiny, smoke-belching cars were greeted like athletes, patted on the back and cheered forward, sometimes pushed forward. Many of the East Germans were stunned by it all. I've been waiting 28 years for this, he told us. Will you come permanently, we asked. How long will you stay? I haven't much money, he said, but I'll stay till I run out of gas.
So the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 is a huge monumental event in the breaking down of this communist versus democratic barrier. Germany had long been a sticking point between the United States and the Soviet Union, and its fragmentation into sectors had caused a physical, tangible barrier between the two nations, and now the fall of this wall is going to lead to further loosening of communism within Eastern Europe. And what we see here on our slide about the reunification of Germany is that, so obviously you want to write down Germany is reunified after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's under the leadership of a man by the name of Helmut Kohl, right? And Helmut Kohl is the chancellor of West Germany, right? And Germany has a chancellor currently in their government. Angela Merkel is their chancellor currently, but they have a democratic system that's set up in Germany. And despite their fears, despite European fears for many, many years after World War II, from the 40s all the way into 1990, here in October of 1990, Helmut Kohl will work here in 1990 to convince the European nations that Germany has no intention of going back to the ways of Kaiser Wilhelm II during World War I or Adolf Hitler in World War II. There is no way they're going to go back to that type of government. And so Helmut Kohl convinces those leaders that Germany is committed to having a democratic system, which they are all the way to this day, 31 years later. And they are there to preserve the rights of humans. We see Germany have taken the lead in housing refugees in Europe currently. All right, so there's a lot going on here with the reunification of Germany that is very important to strengthening of democracy and the breaking down of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. So make sure you write down Helmut Kohl, all right, Chancellor of West Germany, responsible for the reunification of Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall in October of 1990. Now, obviously, everything's not easy for the Germans after they reunify, especially because of that wall. We have a picture here of railroads, a railroad system. Okay, I can tell you for sure that Germany has one of the most comprehensive transportation systems in the world currently. Their railroad system in particular was rather extensive. All right, and so after the reunification of Germany, the German problems existed because in East Germany they had a different gauge for their railroad system, meaning the tracks were a little bit wider apart for the trains, whereas in the West they were a little bit more narrow, so they couldn't use the same train on the same track. And so they're going to need to basically modernize themselves once they've reunified. So because they haven't modernized itself since World War II and industries were failing, all right, Helmut Kohl proposes raising taxes, all right, and Since 1998, Germany has developed one of the most extensive infrastructure systems in the world, some of the greatest highways, the Autobahn, all right, this high-speed highway, and some of the most extensive railroad systems in the world. So make sure that you write down, after the reunification of Germany, Germany really prioritizes modernizing itself, right, and has a very good highway system as well as a very good railroad system. Now, our final slide in our presentation is going to talk a little bit about religion and how the papacy plays a role in the breaking down of communism. And it has to do with the Polish Pope, all right, Pope John Paul II, who in his picture here, you're going to see that his role as one of the most influential men in all of the world, he's going to focus on his homeland, Poland, trying to break free of the chains of communism, and he plays a very important role in providing democratic opportunity in Poland. So in 1990, with the help of Pope John Paul II, there are free elections and democracy becomes a part of Polish government. So we're basically going to write down these bullet points. You don't have to write down every word, but you want to know that Poland moves towards democracy in 1990 with the help of Pope John Paul II. All right. In 1994, Hungary defeats the Communist Party. Right. They're replaced. Right. So again, democratic system replaces a Communist Party here. Right. And so the communists fall out of favor. So Hungary moved towards a much more democratic-leaning government, right? In some cases, we have violent protests that are going to lead to democracy. In Czechoslovakia, we see that in 1989, right? There's killings that happen, mass protests, and despite all this, Czechoslovakia becomes democratic with the election of a president. And then finally, in Romania, all right, the brutal Romanian communist regime is put down by execution of the dictator, and Romania forms a democracy in 1990. So make sure that you write down those particular cases. You don't need to know the full details. Just know that in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, all four of those Eastern European nations are going to turn away from communism and move towards democratic systems from 1989 to 1994. Well, that's it for our presentation today on the thawing of the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States, and we're going to see a better, improving relationship there. And on behalf of the entire World History team, I am Mr. Willis. We will see you guys next time.